So for subtracting real numbers, the idea with this is I'm going to take one that's harder, like negative 3 minus 5. And if you're not comfortable with this, that's pretty normal. People look at this and they're like, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. How do you take away 5 when I already have negative 3? What does it really mean? Well, let's take a simpler one and kind of show how that would work. So my advice is going to be basically to change it. Because you just did section 1.4 and you did adding real numbers and we knocked that out of the park. It was a piece of cake, and all of a sudden we get to subtracting, and I'm going to tell you right now from my experience that I used to teach this, and I would have students and I would just assess them on adding, and I would get like 95% people passing with really high scores on the adding, and they just knock that test out, and then I'd give them a test on subtracting, and I'd have like half the class not pass it. I was like, whoa, 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 this isn't working. Because, subtracting is more complicated, but if we could just, in our minds, figure out how to turn the subtracting back into adding, then really it's not any harder than 1.4. So here's what I know. I know what 8 minus 5 is. Negative 3 minus 5, that weirds me out. But I know that 8 minus 5 is 3. Well, what if I don't want it to be subtraction? Because, like a question up here, that's not really a nice one to have subtracting. What if I could change this into a addition problem? 8 plus what would give me that 3? Well, if I had 8 positives plus 5 negatives, then I know that from the previous section, opposite signs would cancel out. And so I would have 8 positives plus 5 negatives, cancel them out, and leave me with 3 positives. I could take my 8 positives. I could take my 5 negatives. And every plus 1 and minus 1 would zero out, leaving me with 3 positives left. You're like, that's ridiculous. I would never do that with 8 minus 5. I get it. I wouldn't either. 8 minus 5 is 3. That's easy. But how do you do negative 3 minus 5? Well, rewrite it. The phrase that I'll hear on this is state, change. There's a lot of different ways of saying it. So if you like that, you can write stay, change. And basically the first number stays, and then we change it from subtracting to adding, and then we change the 5 to a negative 5. So I could do the same thing up here. Negative 3 minus 5 is the same thing as negative 3 plus negative 5. Stay, change. The negative 3 stays. We change it from subtracting to adding, and we change the 5 to a negative 5. Well, negative 3 plus negative 5, that's a piece of cake. We did that in the previous section. That's basically 3 negatives, 5 more negatives. These don't cancel this time. They combine to give me what? 8 negatives. So for our next example, we have negative 3 minus negative 2. We're going to use that same skill, right? Negative 3 minus negative 2. I could actually logically think about this. If I've got 3 negatives and I take away 2 of them, I'm left with 1. But the idea is that just starts falling apart, starts becoming really complicated. And so, like I said, for something like 8 minus 5, I'm just going to subtract them. Something like this, it's easier if we just turn it into an easier question. We change, right? The negative 3 stays, and then we change it from a subtraction to an addition problem. And what does that do? Well, it takes whatever the number is after it, and it also changes. The whole idea is stay, change. Subtracting a negative is basically the same thing as adding. So now this becomes negative 3 plus 2. That's easy. So we have two things that are opposite signs. Opposite signs, once again from 1.4, they... Okay, so if I've got 3 negatives, 2 positives, every time I got a plus 1 and a minus 1, and so what am I left with here? Negative 1. So this is kind of the skill. We need to know how to subtract. If I have a minus b, that becomes a plus negative b. If I have something like a minus a negative b, this becomes a plus a positive b. Okay. Really, it's the same rule. The second one actually makes a little more sense when we get into multiplying that 2 negatives, because remember, parentheses mean like multiply. we're going to see where the two negatives can multiply. I'm not going to get into that at this point. Okay? So, if I got 3/8 minus -4/5, oh my goodness, the numbers are more complicated, right? Does that mean we start making up new rules? No. You need to know your fraction rules. So, and you could expect that if I'm having questions like this in the notes, I'm going to have them in the homework, you're going to have some of these on the test. I'm going to expect you to be able to do these without a calculator. This will be the last test that you will not be allowed to use a calculator with. So from this point on, you're going to be allowed to use a calculator except for this first test. All right, stay, change, subtraction changes to, and then the -4/5 basically becomes like a. So now I have two fractions that are adding. That's a much easier question. Okay, I've got two denominators, 8 and 5. I cannot add 3/8 and 4/5. They are not the same size pieces. Real quick recap on that. If I were to have, this is 8 pieces, and I've got, what, 3 of them. And the other one is, I've got, what, 5 pieces. Let's see if I can do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So about like that. And I've got 4 of them. I'm trying to add these now, right? They're not the same size pieces. I can't add quarters and dimes. It doesn't work that way. So to make them the same size pieces, I give them a common denominator. The least common denominator of 8 and 5. If you're not sure, start list multiples of 8. 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48, and I just keep going until I find something that 5 goes into as well. We could make them both a 40. How would that be? 8 times 5, 5 times, what is that? 8, I don't know what my brain's doing. Make sure we do top and bottom. So I got 15 over 40 plus 32 over 40. And now we have to remember how to add fractions. We add the parts, we add the numerators. 15 plus 32 would be 47 over, when I add, the pieces stay the same size. They stay over 40. I'm fine with this answer. Feel free to circle that. If I wanted an answer, what's 47 40ths mean? It's a little more complicated. I could divide the 40 into the 47 and have it go in one time with 7 parts left over. I would accept either of these answers. This one makes more sense. Like I've got one whole group and 7 parts out of 40. This one on the left is actually more algebraically easier to work with. I'm fine with either answer at this point. A couple more examples, then we'll kick it up a notch. What's 3 minus 5? That's kind of complicated. It's hard to think about how do you pull up 3 fingers and take away 5. It doesn't work that way. But in mathematics, we have negatives, right? If I start on 3 and I go back 5, I just end up in the negatives. A lot of people will look at this and have no problem and go, oh, that's easy, that's just -2, because they're thinking about the number line. That doesn't bother me. I will encourage you, though, that if you're like, I don't know if I could do that, that you do know that you could make this 3, what? Change, plus, and not 5. 3 plus 5 is not the same thing as 3 minus 5. You have to change. This changes to addition, and the 5 changes to a -5. So I have 3 plus -5, 3 positives, 5 negatives. They combine or they cancel. Positives and negatives cancel, leaving us with -2. 3 minus -5. That's not going to work on the number line. It's like, so now we're going, okay, so we're going to jump backwards negative, and I don't know. What's easier? Change it, just like this subtraction changed to addition. This subtraction changes to addition. Just like that 5 changed to a -5, this -5 changes to a +5. So this just becomes 3 plus 5, 3 positives, 5 positives. If you want to make me sad, start circling these. Why doesn't that make any sense, right? If I have +1 and +1, they don't make zeros. They don't cancel. They combine to give me 8 positives. Here's back to our kind of order of operations PEMDAS stuff. So that I love how this book Doesn't just make that stuff disappear. You have to know how to handle order of operations with this new skill. So I've got parentheses and parentheses. So here's my first set of parentheses. Technically this is a set of parentheses, but there's nothing going on in there. But this set of parentheses in here, we have to take care of first. So PEMDAS, start on the inside. 4 plus 6. Bring the rest of it down. What makes this kind of complicated now? Well, negative 3 minus 10. Now, I actually could do that in my head. I could figure that out. But what I'm really doing, even if I'm doing that quickly in my head, is I am changing this. This subtraction makes it a more complicated question. So I keep the first part. It stays. And then I change it from subtracting to adding the opposite, negative 10. So negative 3 minus 10, in my mind, is the same thing as negative 3 plus negative 10. That's easy. I can do negative 3 plus negative 10. 3 negatives and 10 negatives, since they're the same sign, to give us, it's like 13 negatives. And last but not least, now that we've taken care of those parentheses, I can deal with the subtraction at the bottom. But how do I do 2 minus negative 13? Well, for this subtraction problem, the first part, the 2, stays the same. We change the subtracting to, and the negative 13 becomes a, what is 2 plus 13? And that would be our final answer there. Do a couple more. I encourage you, if you're, feeling confident in this, take a second, just do these and then skip to the answer. And if it's right, keep going. If you're going to make the mistakes, now's the time to do it. Not during the homework, not during the test, right? So feel free to pause this, try to work them out, and see what mistakes you make. Okay? I'm looking at this, order of operations. I'm going to start the innermost set of parentheses. Negative 1 minus 4, I know is negative 5. I'm not trying to make this like easier, or like, okay, how the heck did you know that? Because I think of this as negative 1, instead of subtracting, adding negative 4. Negative 1 plus negative 4 is negative 5. That group has been dealt with. Minus 2. Second group we need to deal with right here. Negative 5 minus 2. I know that that's negative 7. I'm not doing any tricks. All I'm doing, I've had a lot of practice with this, I'm seeing negative 5 minus 2 as negative 5 stays plus negative 2. Negative 5 plus negative 2, they combine to give me 7 negatives. Bring the rest down. Now all I have is 6 minus negative 7. Once again, subtraction problem. I don't do this in my head. I think of this as 6 plus a positive 7. And then 6 plus 7, how about 13? So check that out. Okay? Next one. And this is more like the type of question you would see in the homework. I'm not going to try to just beat you up with lots of these, but the idea is that this all goes together. And I love that when I add fractions, the rules don't change. So we have to keep those skills going, okay? So inside of these kind of parentheses or brackets here, I have two little groups going on, and so I'm going to handle those two groups before I kind of bring them together. Let's start with the easy one. What's 4 minus 1? That's all I would do. Now, I have some people that are like, oh, I didn't think about doing that. They're going to change that to 4 plus negative 1. Does that change the answer? No, right? It's the same answer. 4 minus 1 is 3. 4 plus negative 1 is 3. So if you don't see it, it's not a big deal. It just means you just didn't see it. Now we've got negative 1/3 minus 1/2. I don't know. But I'm not thinking of it like that. I'm thinking of it as negative 1/3 plus, this changes to a negative 1/2. That is the same thing as subtracting, is adding a negative, okay? Now, I need to kind of do this work on the side, so if I have, let me just do this, negative 1/3 plus negative 1/2, I could add these if they have a common denominator. 3 and 2, I need a common denominator of 6. Top and bottom multiplies by 2 is top and bottom by 3. So negative 2/6 plus negative 3/6. Common denominator, I can add those. Negative 2 plus negative 3, they combine to give us negative 5/6. Okay, we're not done. We just kind of started cleaning up the inside. So now what I have is negative 5/6 minus 3. Again, I need to subtract these. They need a common denominator. This right here, this minus 3, it doesn't have a denominator. Well, sort of, right? Whole numbers do have a denominator. We just put them over 1. 3 over 1 is the same thing as 3. So this becomes negative 5/6, stay change, plus negative 3 over 1. Again, I'm going to bring that work to the side. So negative 5/6 plus negative 3 over 1. Common denominator, this one has a 6, this one has a 1. Give this a 6, top and bottom. So I have negative 5/6 plus, how about negative 18/6? Same sign, they combine to give us negative 23/6. So now I have 5 minus, what did this become on the inside? Negative 23 over 6. Almost there. 5 minus a negative. How do I subtract a negative? Stay, change, change. And last but not least, I have 5 over 1 plus 23/6. Take the word about work, to the side. Give them a common denominator. This has a 6, this has a 1. Why don't we just give this one a 6, top and bottom? 30 over 6 plus 23 over 6. 30 plus 23, how about 53 over 6? Definitely more challenging. You can expect those in the homework. I would actually expect most of you to need help with a question like that. If you're making mistakes, that's okay. I'm not trying to beat you up with this, but I am trying to challenge you and have you, because think about it this way. If all I did was have you practice questions that were just as hard as being on the test, and that's like the hardest stuff you're going to see. What I find in mathematics is when we do questions that are like, oh my gosh, this makes my brain hurt, then all of a sudden when we come back over here, right, and I do something that's a little easier, it actually is like, wow, that's really not as bad as I remember it being. So by challenging you with harder mathematics, it makes the stuff that would have been harder for you easier. You're developing your what we call mathematical maturity. Last little thing, and this isn't too huge, but just a quick recap on some ideas. Order matters. X minus y is not the same thing as y minus x. You cannot just switch those, so please be careful with that. 3 minus 5 is not the same thing as 5 minus 3. How do I know? Well, 3 minus 5 is the same thing as 3 plus, change, a negative 5. That's negative 2. 3 positives, 5 negatives. We saw that, right? 5 minus 3, I could make that 5 plus negative 3, but I'm just going to say, I know that's 2. Negative 2 is not equal to 2. You cannot just switch numbers and have it stay true. The order matters in subtraction. It didn't matter in addition. We can actually switch things and do things in different order. Don't do that with subtraction. You will get different answers. They're not equal. Why does that matter? Because at the end of the section, you will probably have a couple word questions. Like we had before, it's just they're going to actually ask you to do the math this time. 4 subtracted from the sum of 8 and negative 3. Okay? This is just kind of building your vocabulary. I'll have a couple things like this on the test, but here's the key. I am subtracting 4 from. So that does not mean 4 minus. If I said subtract 4 from, let's just say 10. If I said subtract 4 from 10, you would not do 4 minus 10. That's utter nonsense. If I said subtract 4 from 10, you could do that in your mind and go, yeah, that's 6. Well, that's not 4 minus 10, that's what? So when they say 4 subtracted from, that means that 4 needs to be subtracted at the end. Subtracted from what? Well, get rid of this. Okay. The sum, that means we're going to add 8 and negative 3. So 4 is going to be subtracted from this grouping, this 8. Sum means added to negative 3. So now that 4 is being subtracted from the sum of 8 and negative 3. Okay? We can now evaluate this. 8 plus negative 3, if I have 8 positives and 3 negatives, hopefully by now we know that those cancel. So that I end up with 5 positives. We have more positives. And then what do I have? 5 minus 4. If you want to make your life a little more complicated, you can make that 5 plus negative 4. But I know that 5 minus 4 is just 1. So on these, they are going to have you write them, and that's going to be part of the homework, but also evaluate them. The difference between, difference means what? We're going to subtract. We're going to subtract negative 5 minus the sum. The sum means that this whole thing is being added and that it is a group. We are grouping the 10 and the negative 7, and sum means we are taking those and we are adding them. The difference between subtract negative 5 and this group. So we have negative 5 minus order of operations here. So we start with the grouping, 10 plus negative 7. They're opposite signs, so they cancel, leaving me with 3 positives. Now I got negative 5 minus 3. That's not cool. It's not easy to do negative 5 minus 3, but I know that means the same thing as negative 5 plus change, a negative 3 change. Negative 5 plus negative 3 is negative 8. One more thing. What is the difference between 134 and negative 80 degrees? So let's say, we're not dealing with 134 degrees here. You know, I guess you could say if I was dealing with a place in the world that was really hot, and one place is 134 degrees, and I measure another place where it's really cold, negative 80 degrees. And somebody goes, what's the difference between those two temperatures? What does difference mean? I like this because I would have some people go 134 minus 80 is 54, which is utter nonsense because there is not 54 degrees between positive 134 and negative 80. This is nonsense. But what difference tells me is that we're going to take those two numbers and we are going to subtract them. 134 minus the negative 80. 134 minus a negative, change becomes plus a positive 80. 134 plus 80, we can do that math on the side, gives me 214 degrees. This makes more sense. If we visualize it, I could even do that. Look, 134 degrees is way over here past 0. And negative 80 is way back here. And so if I want the difference between them, I just basically want to know how far is it between these. It's not 50 degrees. It ends up being from getting from here to here, we would have to add 214. That's it for this section. Not all of this is going to show up on the test. You're like, well, then how the heck do I know what's going to be on the test? Two things. Quizzes in class. If you go through and you do the homework, you're prepared to do the quizzes in class. I will build the test. It should look about 80% of what's on the test will come from your quizzes. Where do you get the other 20%? From your homework and from the reviews. So if you keep up on the quizzes and you keep up on the reviews and on the homework, you should have no problem knowing what's going to be on the test. So keep that up and let me know if you have any questions.